So you have to conserve the right type, shape, and size of rainforest. And governments tend to make conservation areas for two reasons: water catchment, and it's not really suitable for destruction into unsustainable monocultures such as palm oil. And so that's all the hills, but all the nutrients run down the hill, and so the lowland riverine forest is where all the tigers, elephants, orangutans, and humans are trying to live.
All right. Welcome back to another amazing episode of Grow Your Grass Off. We have an amazing guest from Australia. We're on tour in Australia, apparently. So we're happy to introduce Leif, and he works on a lot of amazing projects like the Orangutan Project. And a lot of the work I think that he's presenting is conservation. How do we deal with zone 5, which is cool in permaculture? That's what we want to look at a lot of times. So Leif, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Wow.
So there's a lot that we could uncover here in this episode, but if you want to just talk about your background a little bit, because I'm sure your story is, steeped with, probably trials and tribulations, but also just the fact that it's probably, something that you're really passionate about doing, since you've traveled a lot and you're helping animals. And, for us as a team, Lan and Ian love animals. I do too. So yeah, feel free to take it away and just tell us kind of the background.
Sure. For the last 30 years, I've been working with and studying, protecting and reintroducing back into the wild, in some examples, orangutans. And so when I started the Orangutan Project back in 1998, it was always meant to be the umbrella organization to bring all the biodiversity and people and animals through the extinction crisis and save the last viable ecosystems of the right type, shape, and size of rainforest. For the rainforest to actually be sustainable, because you need the right type, shape, and size to make that happen, but have enough size that the biodiversity and megafauna can survive. Now, we quickly found out there was 3 species that fell outside of this umbrella of conservation, and that was tigers, elephants, and people. And so that's why we started the Forest for People program, and the work with educating children, feeding children, empowering women as a key aspect to our work, and developing new forms of agricultural systems with the Indigenous community. Because remember, these people, just like the orangutans, tigers, and elephants, are the victims. Their rights and their traditional ownership of this land is not respected by the big multinationals, which destroy the rainforest for short-term gain, replacing the forest with unsustainable monocultures such as palm oil and pulp paper. So they have to modify what they're doing, because their systems of survival, either slash and burn agriculture, for example, with the Talak Mullet community, or hunter-gatherers, which, for example, the Orang River community, is actually been sustainable for centuries, but is no longer sustainable. Not because of fault of their own, but because their land, most of their land's been taken away from them. So we have to move them to new forms of regenerative agricultural systems that will make it sustainable, as well as educate and empower them. And we need them to be not only survive, but be educated and become wealthy and prosperous, because wealthy, prosperous, and educated people will be able to resist their land being destroyed, and that will be the ultimate security for these ecosystems we're intending to secure over the next 10 years.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's great to frame it. And for context, I guess, zone 5 in permaculture is really, untamed nature, and that's kind of what I think is interesting, because in Costa Rica, that's where I am. So I feel like I can kind of visualize kind of the places you're talking about in some ways, because in the tropics, it's sort of an act that once you do burn and once you do cut, it's sort of like you've already walked down that path, right? And you can't really come back easily, and so it's almost like you have to keep going in order to maintain some kind of sense of fertility and production, without having to really look at it holistically and say, well, how can we create a system that's holistic and that's beneficial? So, yeah, for me, Zone 5, we interviewed another friend of mine, Gustavo, and he really specializes in plants that are native and that are actually, things that you can cultivate. And to me, I find that really interesting, because I do think we have to engage with that. We have to be in nature. We have to experience it. We've got to realize that it's precious, that we can learn from it. But I think what when you talk, it brings up in me kind of the idea of we're stewards, and we have to really, not just be the extraction mechanism, that there's other people, other, animals in life that we have to pay attention to. So I think it's great. Amazing what you've been up to. Ian and Lana,
you're right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you're right. That's exactly what we need to do. But the other aspect to it is these unsustainable monocultures, and monocultures are unsustainable no matter what they are, and certainly unsustainable in the rainforest. They're about exploitation, having money from the many to the money of the few, money for the long term to the short term. And so developing agricultural practice under the rainforest canopy actually provides long-term economic prosperity and security. The other forms of agriculture are exploitation of local exploitation of the powerless. And so there isn't any dichotomy between the economy and the environment. Is, do we have a long-term economy, which is environmentalism, or do we have a short-term exploitative economy? And who gets exploited? The powerless, the animals, future generations, and indigenous communities.
So can you dive in a little bit more about the food systems you're setting up? What kind of stuff are you setting up for water or proximity to indigenous structures? Kind of what are the main crops or produce that you guys are producing for sustainability for those people? That kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've been developing many sort of agricultural systems under the rainforest canopy, and they include jungle rubber, shade coffee, shade cocoa, vanilla, and sea-lang honey production from the sea-lang honey bee. Now, one of the interesting things about the bee example is our economic structure to produce that, and we're producing it and bringing the honey to market for that, collapsed. Now, one of the problems is we see these feedback loops. Rainforest creates its own rain, its own environment, humidity, temperature, and obviously environmental services. And climate change is affected by rainforest destruction, and climate change affects rainforest productivity. And what we've seen is the raise in average temperatures has killed off all the bees, because we were not winning the war on climate change and destroying the other rainforests around us. And so the important thing is that we're already experiencing the first start of feedback loops, which is why it's so important to get on with these issues. And is when we have local communities who have always been at the bottom of the heap in society and been exploited. Even though we can develop agricultural systems from a cash crop perspective where they become wealthy and prosperous, this isn't suitable for them culturally by itself, because their psychological food security is gained from growing their own food. Worst case scenario, no matter what happens or whoever rips me off, right? If I'm growing my own food, I can support my family. And so that's one of the things we've had to get into, is to understand that personal direct food security, as well as these agricultural systems sympathetically being grown on the rainforest canopy, is needing to develop the agricultural systems of regenerative food production to provide the psychological food security required by the community.
What would you say your main motivation or your driving force to start this project, the Orangutan Project, was or is?
Mm-hmm. Well, what we hope to do is create a better world. And obviously, my expertise and my, has been predominantly with understanding orangutans. Self-aware persons, another fellow great ape that share our planet. In fact, actually, the most intelligent being that shares our planet with us. But as I would say, orangutans may have been the center of my love, but they're not the boundary of my love. And in order for us to save humanity, to save the environment and the world, we have to expand the boundary of our love and connectedness. And so, and this obviously in this case includes the indigenous community. It's not wildlife versus people. It's not the environment versus the economy. It's creating a world where all living beings can and all those good things come along with it together, and therefore the need to look after and protect the indigenous community now and to prosper. One, by the holistic plan, but two, as with all living, the intrinsic value they have as individual persons, and then need to survive and prosper in freedom.
That's awesome, Leif. I mean, to me, it seems like you've got a really rich, undertaking that I imagine is really rewarding to see the results, because I don't know, I love watching nature channels, and all these things that you kind of get exposed to, life in that way, and the interconnectedness, I think it's a driving goal, I think, that we have, is that we leave it better than we found it, and I think that when you speak about the, people being self-sufficient, at least to feel that sense of ability to take care of one's own, food supply, I think that's huge, because, I think I've heard that there's, if you're having to, say, encroach on the wildlife, in order to feel like you can produce your own food, to me, it's not, like you said, it's not mutually exclusive. It's not that we have these boundaries made up and we have to be able to coexist, I guess, is kind of what I'm hearing. It's like, how do we do that successfully? And so I think permaculture offers a lot of solutions there, as far as how do we maximize the space, the edge, and if we're not encroaching, if we're not going into that, let's just call it, pristine environment that the animals really need to function well, there's got to be a way for us to do both, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. We are, essentially, part of the environment, and us living in harmony environment is not only a good thing to do, necessary for our long-term survival. But also, one of the wonderful things is when you're working in these environments, which is actually where we evolved. This is where we come from. There is this beauty, majesty, and this connections with nature that we're often missing when we're taken out of our natural environment, and living kind of disconnected lives with who we really are.
On that same thread, you mentioned orangutans are the most advanced. Is that right? The most advanced primate that you've seen in terms of that whole spectrum of abilities and cognitive ability?
Yeah, exactly. They're the most intelligent being that shares our planet. Self-aware persons, just as we are. That's a bit, off the walls and calling a non-human a person, but that information can be backed up. And one of the interesting things is, obviously, orangutans have this, like humans, predominantly adapt to the environment through culture rather than natural selection alone. This is how humans also predominantly adapt to the environment. And that includes, obviously, finding food sources within the rainforest, but also finding medicines that treat malaria, topical medicines for injuries and cuts. And one of the interesting things is when we're looking at orangutans and go, okay, they're using this plant for this purpose, And then we kind of then you ask the local indigenous communities, and they say, oh yeah, we use the same plant for the same purpose. So you have these two self-aware persons, coming up with similar solutions within the same environment, which is obviously fascinating to watch.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, because if it's almost like if we rewind and we slow our life down, how much can we really learn by just watching? And these, is there anything else that you've noticed? I'm sure there's tons of data and all these things you've looked at, but like, what have you seen that we can emulate? With these beings that are, I guess I'm trying to draw out the idea of how do they do it, and how can we mimic them? You know what I mean, in that sense.
Yeah, there's kind of two aspects to it. I call orangutans a more noble form of humanity. So although, for example, us and our closest relatives, chimpanzees, are so much capable of so much love, compassion, empathy, we're capable of so much horror, destruction, and maliciousness, which is part of the human and also the chimpanzee side. But that is simply not part of the orangutan world. Orangutans, although the males are 7 times stronger than man, and the canines are the same size as a tiger, although we killed over 1 million and slaughtered them in the most horrific ways that we can imagine, there's not one case in a zoo, sanctuary, or in a wild orangutan ever killing a human being. So they are in many ways a more noble form of humanity. The other aspect to what is for humans is the agricultural revolution 2,000 years ago and industrial revolution 200 years ago, from an evolutionary perspective, is insignificant. In other words, we are still basically evolved and adapted to be hunters and gatherers. That's how we work in these small tribal systems. So it's fun in a ways, and we're not quite up to the task of living in the world and the technology that we've created. And this forms all sorts of personal psychological dysfunction, as well as civilizational dysfunction. The wonderful thing about orangutans is they're actually still living in the environment for which they've evolved over millions of years, so that you can see that intimate connection and harmony between the way we live. And this is, of course, one of the segues in is the indigenous communities, their values and connection with the ecosystem can be actually some of the ways that we can learn, to survive and live in the modern environment. So both orangutans and the indigenous communities we can learn as modern people a lot, and need to emulate. And I would argue we need to do this in order to secure our environment, because dysfunctional tribal mind trying to survive in a global environment, exploiting future generations and others, it's unsustainable. And so this moral as well as cultural evolution is key to our survival.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm just sort of struck by the idea of, them, they're probably just grounded, and, they've got all these good things happening as far as being connected to nature. And obviously if their habitat's being destroyed, then there's probably these moments of stress and things. But I guess what question came up for me when you were speaking there is, have you guys noticed how they tend the land that they're on to maintain it, as especially when we're talking about growing? Or do they have that kind of way to plug in, or are they really just looking at the resources and sort of popping around, and not extracting too much, but being able to kind of float?
No, it's a very, very interesting question, and the nuance into this. So as I mentioned before, that the slash-and-burn agriculture communities have been, they cut down a bit of forest, burn it, because the rainforest soil is surprisingly poor in value, in nutrients, and then they grow crops for approximately 3 years till the soil becomes infertile, and they move on. Now, this system has been sustainable over centuries because by the time they come back, the rainforest naturally regenerates the soil and it continues on. And also the hunter-gatherers have been hunting and gathering in a sustainable way for centuries. It's not sustainable anymore, not because of fault of their own, but because the vast majority of their ancestral land has been taken away by greedy multinationals who haven't even recognized it, have been present, needs to learn their rights on this land. Now, we adapt to the environment, and I may have mentioned, predominantly via culture. This is the same as orangutans. And so they have a whole culture of hunter-gathering and slash-and-burn agriculture, which is sustainable. Now, the trouble is also culture, more than natural selection alone, is very good at adapting to the environment, but it can't adapt as quickly as is needed in the modern environment. And so we've got perfect examples in North America and Australia, where indigenous communities, where the environment changes rapidly, and then the culture becomes dysfunctional because it is unable to adapt quickly enough to the very rapidly changing environment. And therefore the culture becomes maladjusted, and we see the destruction of individuals as well as indigenous communities because of our, as humanity's, inability to rapidly change our culture, because this is a very new phenomenon. So what we have to deal with is indigenous communities who then now way of life, not for fault of their own, is unsustainable. And this is the culture that they've grown up and work with. So we have to move them to regenerative and other agriculture systems which are sustainable. And this has to be done sensitively, right, and in empowering and in connection, because it's not hard to change one's culture. This is, because we're very much, it doesn't have that extreme fluidity that is required for these rapid changes. And so that requires a hell of a lot of work and progress and connection. And one of the things we're doing, and for example, the Talek Mullet community, when we started, they didn't name their children until they're 6 years old because they probably wouldn't survive. So why get attached to them? So we started feeding the children, educating the children, provided a midwife, and then also high school and university scholarships for them. So first of all, we deal with the immediate crisis issue, i.e., your children are starving and are dying. Okay, and then we can provide that breathing space, and go, okay, you've had this traditional agricultural system that is now dysfunctional, not because of your fault, because your rights have not been recognized. And then we go sympathetically take the community on this journey to a better life. And ultimately, because their land has been taken away from them for two reasons: they're uneducated and have no power, i.e. money. If we can leave the community both educated and wealthy, which is the goal here, then we can really secure the system and the ecosystems for the long term.
When it comes to growing food, do you have any kind of homestead on your property? Do you have animals? What kind of system do you have in place where you're at?
Mm-hmm. Well, our first trials was, so the evolution of the process is essentially a learning process. So we started developing the jungle rubber, the shea coffee, shea cocoa, vanilla, and the sea-lang honey business we mentioned. And these are all predominantly cash crops. So you earn a lot of money, then you can buy what you need. And as I mentioned, that wasn't culturally appropriate because they needed to feel security of growing their own food. And so we're developing with our partners who are experts in this field, regenerative agriculture, literally around the village, so they don't have to go and cut down a new field, and so and grow there. They can do it right there, and that's about obviously the mulching and the connection with the two species that they do hold around their villages, chickens and goats. other two animal species which are there. And so it's about integration in some senses, and it's a continued learning process. So to bring on the new systems and connect it with their existing lifestyle, you know, and their existing what food they like to grow, and the animals which they are already living with.
Yeah.
So what you're saying there, Leif, is just you notice that by integrating the animals, the nutrient cycling and everything seem to improve, right? Because that's kind of what permaculture speaks to a lot, is that the fertility is such an important process. Is that what you guys are noticing?
Yeah, no, exactly. You know, just as when they did slash and burn agriculture, it was not only the plants, but the animals that regenerated the soil, you know, and the whole biodiversity. We have to kind of replicate that, you know, in the food systems around the village, and that connective of all life.
That's great. Ian's into tortoises, by the way, Leif. If he wants to do an exotic pet farm or pet zoo, right?
Yeah, I love orangutans. I love tigers. I love elephants. So super excited to talk to you about it. And you know, anything new or upcoming that you have planned, or going to different species, or really focusing on those three and the indigenous people? Anything new and exciting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, why we have those there's three species. I mean, originally the orangutans were the umbrella species for which everyone else went along for the free ride under their conservation, conserving their ecosystems and their populations. And the elephants, tigers, and the humans were the species which were falling outside of that umbrella, that we need to have specific projects to bring them in under a holistic conservation as well as welfare issue. Now, there's a couple of issues. Is you just can't save a better rainforest and expect it to survive. It creates its own environment. So you have to conserve the right type, shape, and size of rainforest. And governments tend to make conservation areas for two reasons: water catchment, and it's not really suitable for destruction into unsustainable monocultures such as palm oil. And so that's all the hills, but all the nutrients run down the hill, you know, and so the lowland riverine forest is where all the tigers, elephants, orangutans, and humans are trying to live. So we have to piece together ecosystem of the right type, shape, and size, right, to bring the whole ecosystem, a sustainable ecosystem, and therefore sustainable populations of people and animals through the extinction crisis. Now, unfortunately, we only got the next 10 years to do this. After this, there will not be any viable ecosystems left. Ecosystems will be too small, fragmented, the wrong type, shape, and size, and eventually collapse in on itself. So I always call this the most important decade in human history. And so we're trying to secure, we're working in 7, I'm hoping for 8 ecosystems, and that we can put together all the right type, shape, and size through an eclectic mix of leasing land purchase, working with community forest, and putting the holistic conservation efforts to these kind of arcs of biodiversity. Now, is that enough to save our planet? No. You know, climate scientists saying, as well as having these arcs of biodiversity, saving them, we have to rewild about 25% of our planet to stabilize the planet, as well as all the other things we need to do. And so this will be at least the framework, the resource, which will allow future generations to do that. And this is why I always repeat, we're living in the most important decade in human history, and therefore the importance of the work that we're all doing during this most critical time.
That's great. I appreciate you going through the mechanics there, because I was curious how it seemed to me that you could, you know, dovetail a lot of these projects together, right? So it's almost like you could overlay them in some ways, because you're doing a similar act, right, in terms of carving out space, like you said, to create an ecosystem that allows for all that native, you know, flora and fauna, right? So, and that's, yeah, maybe because to me that seems to be the call to action, really, is that you've got to have support on these different, you got to have the funding, you've got to have the people who are willing to know the local cultures and the indigenous way of life to integrate the community well. You need to have, the plan of action of how you're going to accomplish it. And, can you speak to that a little bit? What is it that you need, and what are those sort of strings that you need to pull,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the answer to the second question is just to bring it back to the bit is, as human beings, we're pretty useless and stupid. We think we are. And probably your memory stick stuck into your computer now, it probably contains more information than your brain will ever do, But how is successful? By collectivizing, and working together, bringing talent, knowledge and resources from a whole variety. And this is why we're so successful. And so my role as a leader of these projects is to bring together, and collectivize, a multitude of people and talents together to work for the larger vision, and now the other thing, of course, is, and that's, everyone knows that, for example, in Australia or in America, there's two examples. Although productivity of workers and corporate profits have increased since the 1970s, worker wages haven't, because they've stopped people collectivizing into unions, and which allows them to gain power and influence. Now, on the other side of the spectrum is really successful people understand also to collectivize capital and form companies to become successful in the world. Both are intelligent collectivizations, which allows humans to become successful. And one of the biggest challenges, of course, is it's far more harder than collectivizing the human capital and knowledge that we're using to save these last viable ecosystems, is collectivizing the capital, i.e. the fundraising, which is a rate determining step, which is preventing us from moving as quickly as we would like to save these ecosystems.
Can you let people know how to connect with you and possibly offer any kind of donations or support for your project? Let our listeners know.
They can go to our website, the orangutanproject.org, and become a regular giver, or I'll give a major gift to help support our work, and then obviously sign up for the newsletters and everything, and get connected, and together join us on this journey to make the world a better place. And which ultimately, is all good solutions are always win-win solutions. And the fact that, we feel in this time so disempowered, in our ability to make meaningful change. But by collectivizing our capital and our labor in this way, in a way that's going to do a holistic good for everybody, makes us feel good and empowered, and connected. So it's a win-win situation for everybody on this journey.
It's amazing. Yeah. Thanks so much for what you're doing, Leif. I mean, is it really, the project itself is centered on rainforest sort of, environments. Is that strategic in a way though too, right?
I mean, rainforest is, especially the Indonesian rainforest, is the highest biodiversity. And we know the more biodiverse the environment is, more carbon it holds and more sustainable and secure it is. And, one of the biggest drivers of climate change is the destruction of the rainforest. But on the other side, the protection and restoration of rainforest is one of the most cost-effective things we can do to mitigate climate change and stabilize our environment. So yes, savanna environments and many other environments around the world are obviously important part of the mix. It just happens that rainforest is a low-hanging fruit, to give us maximum bang for our buck at this very, very critical decade in human history.
Any other highlights, Leif, that you want to make sure to include?
Other than, just help people connect. And I've got several books, Orangutans, my cousins, my friends, and finding our humanity, which deals with often our relationship with the environment and humanity, and our connection. So that may be particular of interest to your audience.
Awesome. Would you consider yourself kind of, because I haven't looked at it deeply, but is Jane Goodall kind of, she was into gorillas and things, right?
Jane was into chimpanzees.
Chimpanzees, okay.
Our closest and most like us ancestor. And she continues to be a wonderful advocate, not only for her beloved chimpanzees, but to help the world environment.
Is it, because I'm just curious, is your, this is kind of a tangent, but what she's done in that, she's more about the relationships and the learning and the research per se. Have you guys done a similar process though? I don't know enough about it, but to get into it and say, okay, we've developed and cultivated this relationship to know a lot about, orangutans, for instance. Is it a similar process that you guys have been on?
I think it's complementary. I mean, how I would say it is, I'm a big favor of education of future generations, as Jane is. However, as I mentioned, I believe this is the most important decade in human history. We can't just hand over to better educated future generations and expect them to have a recoverable planet. It's our responsibility now. The second aspect to it is the best education is demonstrating you're actually doing it and show them a role model for effective and meaningful change. That's the best education you can give to young people, not just talking about it, but actually being it, and those are the two aspects to it. Is the only the only other subtle thing is in my philosophy would be, Jane would be very much talking to you now about hope, hope for, and I'm not so much on hope. Hope comes with this console, despair. And because the reason being is I characterize conservation as a marathon with hurdles with a professional boxer punching you in the face every 100 meters. It's tough work. And if you're living off hope, you're going to get despair very quickly. What I always encourage to do is subtly different. And I've explored this in Finding Our Humanity, which becomes more of a connection with the spiritual progress of humanity. If we find that joy and love within ourselves and we express that, selflessly express that, and that provides untold energy, and connection, a love for other living beings, and a love for nature, and that I believe is a far more sustainable, form of our relationship with our work and what we're trying to achieve.
Well said.
Well, thank you, Leif, and
Yes.
we'll definitely share your books and links, that we have in the description, and it'd be fantastic to follow up and see how things are going.
Oh, it'd be much welcome. Thank you, guys. Thank you all.
Yes. Thank you for being here.
Take care.